Some people use faith to find comfort. Others use it as a weapon for change. Throughout American history, certain believers didn't just pray for a better world. They fought to create one. They stood in front of angry mobs to defend the enslaved. They marched through streets where they weren't welcome, demanding rights they were denied. They fed the hungry when government wouldn't and sheltered the homeless when society looked away. Some became heroes celebrated in history books. Others remained controversial figures whose names spark debate even today. They wielded scripture like a sword, turning love your neighbor from a pleasant platitude into a radical demand for justice. They made powerful people deeply uncomfortable, and they changed America in ways we're still living with. So today we're asking, how did Christian reformers shape the moral and social direction of America? And what can their successes and their failures teach us about faith as a force for change? A Christian reformer isn't just someone who believes certain things. It's someone who acts on those beliefs in ways that challenge the status quo. Throughout American history, these reformers have tackled slavery and abolition, civil rights and racial justice, poverty and economic inequality, prison reform and criminal justice, workers' rights and labor conditions, women's suffrage and gender equality. The prophet Micah wrote, "Act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly." Micah 6:8. But what does that look like in practice? For Christian reformers, it meant more than charity. It meant confronting systems, challenging laws, and demanding that America live up to its professed values. Yet reform movements raise uncomfortable questions. When does faith inspire progress, and when does it become politically divisive? How do you know when you're following God's call versus your own agenda? And why do Christians so often disagree about what justice actually requires? These aren't just historical questions. They're questions every generation of believers must answer for themselves. In 19th century America, Christianity was used to justify the greatest evil in the nation's history: slavery. Southern preachers quoted Paul's letters about servants obeying masters. They argued that slavery was God's ordained social order, that questioning it was questioning God himself. But other Christians read the same Bible and reached radically different conclusions. Harriet Beecher Stowe, daughter of a prominent minister, wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel that exposed slavery's brutality through Christian moral language. Abraham Lincoln reportedly told her, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." Frederick Douglass, himself escaped from slavery, drew a sharp distinction between what he called the Christianity of Christ and the Christianity of this land. One freed people, the other enslaved them. They couldn't both be genuine. Quakers risked everything running the Underground Railroad, believing that harboring escaped slaves was obedience to God, even when it violated the law. For them, justice trumped legality. The prophet Amos thundered, "Let justice roll down like waters." Amos 5:24. And abolitionist Christians took that literally. They demanded an end to slavery, not gradually, not eventually, but now, because enslaving people made in God's image was intolerable sin. Here's the question that still echoes. Why did some Christians defend slavery while others fought against it using the same Bible? The text didn't change. What changed was whether readers prioritized passages about obedience to authority or passages about liberation and justice. The Bible could be wielded as either sword or shield, depending on whether you were the oppressor or the oppressed. By the late 1800s, America was transforming. Industrial capitalism created enormous wealth and enormous suffering. Children worked in factories. Laborers lived in squalor. Cities teemed with immigrants struggling to survive. Traditional Christianity said, save their souls and their circumstances don't matter. The social gospel movement said, that's not enough. Leaders like Walter Rauschenbusch argued that Christianity had to address not just individual sin, but systemic injustice. It wasn't enough to preach personal salvation while workers labored 70-hour weeks for starvation wages. Faith required reforming the systems that crushed people. Churches established settlement houses, providing education, healthcare, and legal aid in urban slums. They supported labor unions fighting for workers' rights. They advocated for child labor laws, workplace safety regulations, and a living wage. Critics then and now argued this was social gospel replacing the true gospel, that Christians should focus on spiritual matters and let government handle social problems. But social gospel advocates insisted you couldn't separate the two. How could you preach God's love while ignoring the suffering right in front of you? How could you talk about salvation while people starved? Jesus fed the hungry, healed the sick, challenged unjust religious and political systems. The social gospel movement argued they were simply following his example. The question persists: should religion focus primarily on personal salvation or systemic reform? On getting souls to heaven or making earth more like heaven? Maybe that's a false choice. Maybe authentic faith requires both. But American Christianity has never agreed on the answer. Overturning tables in the temple. He made white Christians choose: stand with the oppressed like Jesus did, or side with the power structures Jesus challenged. Let freedom ring, not just a political slogan, but a religious conviction that every person bears God's image and deserves dignity, rights, and equality. The strategy worked because King spoke America's religious language. He called the nation to live up to its professed Christian values. He didn't ask for special treatment. He demanded America practice what it preached. But here's the complexity: King was radical. The FBI considered him dangerous. White churches largely opposed him. Even many black churches thought he moved too fast, pushed too hard, created too much tension. Can faith-based activism unite society? Not initially. King's movement divided America between those who believed justice required action and those who believed order required patience. Only in retrospect did he become the unifying figure we remember today. The story of Christian reform in America isn't complete without the women, who often faced double opposition, challenged both for their politics and for daring to lead as women. Dorothy Day combined radical Catholicism with radical politics. She founded the Catholic worker movement, running houses of hospitality for the poor, publishing newspapers advocating for workers and the marginalized, and living in voluntary poverty and solidarity with those she served. The Catholic hierarchy was deeply uncomfortable with her. The FBI kept a file on her for decades, but she insisted this was Christianity in action, following Jesus, who said, "Whatever you do for the least of these, you do for him." Then there were the women of the temperance movement, often dismissed now but representing genuine reform efforts. They witnessed alcohol destroying families, enabling domestic violence, keeping workers in poverty. Their faith-based advocacy helped pass child labor laws, establish juvenile courts, and create social safety nets. Women fought for suffrage partly on religious grounds. If women were made in God's image, why shouldn't they vote? If Christianity taught equality of souls, why not equality of rights? Jesus said, "Whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me." Matthew 25:40. These women took that seriously, caring for orphans, visiting prisoners, feeding the hungry, housing the homeless. But they didn't just provide charity. They demanded systemic change that would make charity less necessary. They faced criticism from all sides: too radical for traditional churches, too religious for secular reformers, too feminist for society, too female for leadership roles. But they persisted because their faith wouldn't let them do otherwise. Here's what history teaches: authentic reform movements make powerful people very, very uncomfortable. Abolitionists were attacked by mobs, their meeting halls burned, their leaders sometimes killed. Frederick Douglass was beaten. Elijah Lovejoy, an abolitionist newspaper editor, was murdered by a pro-slavery mob. Martin Luther King Jr. was surveilled by the FBI, which considered him one of the most dangerous men in America. His home was bombed. He received death threats constantly. He was ultimately assassinated. Dorothy Day was investigated, arrested multiple times, and vilified as a communist threat to American Christianity. The pattern is clear. Christian reformers who challenge systems of power face fierce resistance, often from the very institutions claiming to represent Christianity. Southern churches defended slavery and segregation using Scripture. Northern churches preached gradual change and patience. Mainstream denominations disciplined reformers for being too radical, too political, too divisive. When does religious reform become threatening to established power? The moment it stops being theoretical and starts demanding concrete change. When it challenges not just individuals but systems. When it names specific injustices rather than speaking in vague platitudes about loving everyone. Comfortable Christianity is never controversial. It's when faith demands sacrifice from those with power that opposition emerges. often wrapped in religious language about order, tradition, and proper Christian behavior. The reformers didn't just face opposition from secular forces, they faced it from religious institutions invested in the status quo. And that opposition was often fiercer and more personal than any external attack. Walk through America today and you'll see the legacy of Christian reformers everywhere. The civil rights laws that ended legal segregation, the labor protections that ended child labor and established weekends, the social safety net that feeds the hungry and houses the homeless, the charitable organizations providing healthcare, education, and disaster relief. Much of America's moral progress traces back to believers who insisted faith required action, that loving God meant loving neighbor in concrete, costly ways. James wrote, "Faith without works is dead." James 2:17. The reformers took that seriously. They understood that belief without action was empty, that prayer without justice was noise, that worship without mercy was hypocrisy. But their legacy is complicated. Some reforms succeeded, others failed. Some reformers were vindicated by history, others remain controversial. And Christians continue to disagree violently about what justice requires and whether faith should engage politics at all. Progressive Christians invoke the social gospel and Martin Luther King Jr., arguing faith demands addressing systemic injustice. Conservative Christians warn against replacing the gospel with social activism, insisting faith is primarily about salvation, not social change. Both sides claim the reformers' legacy. Both quote Scripture. Both believe they're following Jesus. So the question persists: what role should faith play in shaping social change? And who gets to decide what Christian reform looks like? Did Christian reformers transform America primarily through faith or through activism? Maybe that's the wrong question. For them, faith and activism were inseparable. Their beliefs demanded action. Their theology required justice. Their understanding of God's character meant they couldn't remain comfortable while others suffered. Can religion remain a force for social progress in a divided society? History says yes, but never without controversy, never without cost, and never with universal agreement about what progress means. Today's reformers face the same questions their predecessors did. How do you balance spiritual concerns with social action? When does prophetic witness cross into political partisanship? Whose interpretation of justice reflects God's will? And how do you reform systems without compromising your faith? Who are the reformers shaping America's future? That depends on who you ask. Some see reformers and immigration activists quoting, "Love the stranger." Others see them in religious liberty advocates defending traditional values. Some find them in racial justice movements citing the prophets. Others identify them in pro-life activism. The debates haven't ended. They've just changed form. And that might be the truest legacy of Christian reformers. Not a finished blueprint for justice, but the persistent conviction that faith requires seeking it. The legacies of others. But they shared something essential: the conviction that faith meant more than personal salvation, that following Jesus required confronting injustice, and that loving God demanded loving neighbor in ways that cost something. They changed laws, shifted culture, and forced America to wrestle with the gap between its ideals and its reality. Sometimes they inspired unity. More often, they provoked conflict, but their impact is undeniable. The work they started isn't finished. New injustices demand new reformers. And somewhere in America today, someone is reading Scripture and deciding, like the abolitionists, like King, like Dorothy Day, that their faith won't let them stay silent. That's the legacy that endures. Not consensus about what justice requires, but commitment to seeking it, even when it's costly. This is the Scholar's Ledger, where we explore how faith has shaped American history, for better and worse. Subscribe, share, and join us in the search for truth.